Hello, welcome. I'm Ash Montes, talking all things UX research. Recently, I did a video on how teams hire UX researchers, going over the screening call with a recruiter. And now in part 2, we'll see what happens in the job interview. With each video, the idea is to talk about how things are set up nowadays, but also why they're set up this way. If you want to improve your chances of success in a job interview, the first thing is to have clarity on what the company, the team is looking for. This way, you can more or less anticipate some of the questions they'll be asking. I'll let Lawton speak. Lawton and Thomas were the two researchers who did a presentation on this topic recently. Presentation that is the inspiration for this trilogy of videos.
What I would advise job seekers to do is go through the job description, and if it's decently well written, try to anticipate what questions might look like. And typically a behavioral question will be something that says like, tell me about a time. So if you can kind of structure your own mock interview questions around that, you're probably going to be hitting close on what might be present in the interview itself.
Okay, a couple of things to call out here. First, you've heard that if you're applying for a job that has a clear job description, you can notice the things that matter to the team. True. But there's a number of times you'll be facing a generic job description. Doesn't really reveal what they're looking for. In that case, you either have to do some research on your own, on the team, the company, to try and figure this out, or you try to get this information from the recruiter when you speak to them on the screening call. Yeah. The second point is Lawton mentioned behavioral questions, and I think this is a time to speak about question types. In an interview, you would usually face three types of questions: behavioral questions, technical questions, and in some cases, situational questions.
So a technical interview is really questions around, for a UX researcher role, it would be those research competencies. So, the example of statistics or study design, which methodology would you choose? How would you frame these results? How would you present these results? Those sorts of scenarios that are really specific to the researcher role.
You've just heard questions on the technical side, and they're about UX research knowledge. The manager would evaluate the candidate based on accuracy, depth of knowledge. When applying for a job, scan the job description, see if they're expecting a quantitative researcher, a mixed methods researcher, or a qualitative researcher. For quant or mixed methods researchers, a typical technical question would be around statistics, while for qual researchers, technical questions tend to be around sampling, recruitment, or reasons to choose one methodology over the other. Nowadays, there's also some emphasis on metrics, how to track and measure success. And I plan on making a whole video on the topic, so watch out for that. Technical questions can have a reputation for being stressful because you have to know the answer. But with UX research, usually the interviewer asks in a way that doesn't put you in an uncomfortable position. It tends to be more open-ended.
But that's really only half of what we do as researchers. So, a lot of that's actually working and cross-collaborating with stakeholders in a variety of different roles, whether that's design, product, engineering. So that's where the behavioral interviews come into play, where it's really more around how do you work with these people. So these are where you're going to get questions like, tell me about a time that you had to deliver some bad news to a stakeholder, or, tell me about a time when there was a disagreement on your team. Like, what did that look like? What did you do?
And here you've heard some examples of behavioral questions. It's very common to have questions related to stakeholders. The one I probably was asked the most was, tell me about a time you had to deal with difficult stakeholders. It's a classic. The other common topic is around communication and strategy. Here's a few more examples. These are all typical behavioral questions. To be clear, behavioral questions are assessing past behavior and how the candidate handled specific situations. The purpose is to understand more soft skills, and there's a lot of emphasis on concrete examples and well-structured stories that shows your skills. Let's say they asked about an example of your communication strategy when sharing research insights. So let's make this real simple. Problem, action, results.
Problem. I worked on a research project and had all the insights to share. But most of the devs couldn't make time for the presentation. They were super busy, so only a few had a chance to hear me out. What I did next was to share a top 5 insights on the Slack channel with the team. I also linked to a Loom video with me walking through the full presentation. Then I tagged a few key engineers. That did the trick. Soon enough, the insights sparked a nice debate on Slack as we discussed potential solutions. Despite stakeholders being a bit elusive to engage, sharing the research across a meeting, a Slack channel, and with a video recording, that made it work.
This is a very simple illustration. We're going for concrete examples, specific cases. Now back to the question types. Depending on the company, they would say, oh, you'll have a behavioral interview or a technical interview. Nowadays, it seems it's not so much the case. And you also might get questions about the hypothetical or situational. Most of the hypothetical questions are related to constraints. What would you have done differently if you had less money, if you had a shorter timeline? What would you have done differently now that you went through the whole process? That's more of a reflective question, pushing for a learner's mindset. If you prepare for those questions and think of examples to support what you're saying, you're giving yourself the best shot for the job.
A hiring manager was asking me about these findings and said, so, what are the best questions? Is there like a question bank somewhere? And like, yeah, you can go online and I'm sure, Ash, you could pick up some of these resources where it's like common questions that you'll get in a behavioral interview or a technical interview with a UX research hiring manager.
Yes, good point. I've collected some really good articles and list of questions. So yes, check the summary down below and have a peek at all the resources. It's pretty comprehensive. Moving on to the interview format.
There's a wide range of how we could do these interviews. And the spectrum that we think about most, because we think it's the one that will impact the results the most, is the level of structure that's applied. And structured interviews are basically techniques where we have standardized questions, evaluation criteria, scoring rubrics, and a way to, in the end, come up with a combined score between different interviewers.
What does that mean? We have a set list of questions to ask, and you score each answer, and that's how you evaluate the candidate. And based on a number of research studies, there are some significant benefits in running a structured interview. It's a way to reduce bias in the hiring process, and also they give more confidence in predicting if the candidate is good. But then you ask, are structured interviews common when hiring UX researchers?
Only about a little over 50%, I think, of hiring teams actually use standardized questions. And those numbers just go down. Like rubrics, I think, are only used by 30-something%. Actual mathematical scoring is only used by about 20%. So these structuring techniques are really powerful at making our interviews better. But as a field and broadly across industries, this is also true, they're underutilized.
You can see here that the common interview format that you're actually going through is the unstructured interview. Why is that?
Something like 2/3 of all hiring managers have never even had any form of training on interviewing or effective interview processes. Most of us haven't necessarily gone through the learning of what constitutes effective interviewing. So that's one. The second reason is that setting up a structured interview, it's a bit of an investment, right?
What I've heard is that it takes some investment to set up proper structured interviews. And there's this other point that Thomas made on training. It parallels this common misconception in our line of work. Is an interview just the same as a conversation? If we come up with a list of questions and kind of had to follow them, some people feel like it ruins the flow of the conversation. Also, the structured interview forces the interviewer to focus on the details of the answer instead of how the candidate is throughout the conversation. To some managers, that feels like stopping them from relying on their gut feeling. But of course, that's exactly the purpose of structured interviews, to stop gut feeling and bias to creep in. Still, it's likely today you would face an unstructured interview, meaning the team would have a few agreed questions, but the rest would be more open-ended, and the interviewer has some leeway to guide the discussion. And finally, here's my suggestion on how to end your interview on a high note. You certainly heard about the importance of asking questions as a candidate, asking questions to the interviewer so you're not passive, you're not just taking it all in. But then what I see is a candidate like, oh no, I just have to ask these questions just to show that they've done their homework and they're committed to asking a question. The power of asking questions is to create a conversation. Ask one thoughtful question. Let the interviewer respond, then build on their answer by connecting it to your interests or strengths. Let's say I ask about an initiative the team took to help designers with usability testing. The interviewer answers, and that's an opportunity for me to describe a previous experience I had or something that connects to their answer. One last tip, and this is for your own benefit. After you've gone through the job interview, stop and reflect. How did you feel? Did you think the interviewer was asking appropriate questions, probing you in the right direction? Was the interviewer able to shine a light on your strengths, your weaknesses? Did they allow you time to ask questions in the end, or was it rushed? There's this great quote from the Nielsen Norman Group on an article on this topic. Your user experience during hiring interviews is a great preview of your user experience as an employee. So keep that in mind. Did you watch the first one already? And subscribe if you want to know more about the last stage, the work sample or presentation. I've also shared down below the articles written by Thomas and Lawton. Both of them have newsletters. If you want to sign up to it, I would recommend it. And I'll see you around.